Today, along with Australians everywhere, we gather to remember those who have served to defend Australia. We do this because it is the anniversary of the day when Australian and New Zealand soldiers landed on the beach at Gallipoli in Turkey on the 25th of April 1915. This was the first major military campaign for soldiers from Australia and New Zealand. Since then, the 25th of April has been known as Anzac Day. Anzac comes from the name Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. It was shortened to Anzac in 1915. Since then, when Australians and New Zealanders have served together, they have often been known as Anzacs. At Gallipoli, Australians and New Zealanders served with soldiers from other nations, including England, France, and India. The Australians at Gallipoli came from all sorts of backgrounds, but they shared the terrible experience of war. Ever since then, for more than 100 years, the men and women in our Navy, Army, and Air Force have honoured the memory of our original Anzacs. On Anzac Day, there are many ways to honour people who have served and those who continue to serve in Australia's armed forces. We can gather together like this, listening to a podcast, attend a dawn service, or an Anzac Day march. We can also wear a sprig of rosemary as a symbol of remembrance. Towards the end of the ceremony, the last post is played on a bugle. This historical music was played in army camps to announce the end of the day, a time when soldiers should be resting. The last post is played on Anzac Day for those who made the ultimate sacrifice. It means they have done their duty and they are now at rest. After the last post, there is 1 minute of silence. This is a time to think about those who have served in Australia's armed forces, those who continue to serve, and about those who have lost their lives. So it is Anzac Day, Ryan. That's our minute of silence, our way of honor, our small way of honouring the people who have given so much to our country at war. Always an emotional time in Australia. I think it's probably the most important holiday on the calendar. It's way more important than the religious holidays. It's more important than Australia Day. I think it's probably the most important, to me, it's probably the most important holiday on the calendar.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And good to be chatting with you, mate, on this fantastic day that honours, those few people that have done so much for our country and ultimately our identity. And I would agree with you. Most important holiday that we have to pay our respects.
And something which is probably in the last 20 odd years, which is, it doesn't really symbolize, nothing symbolizes war and people losing their lives. But I think a way they've really managed to honor the Anzac sort of spirit is through sporting events here in Australia. And they obviously have the Anzac Day rugby, they have the Anzac Day football over the last sort of 20 odd years. Again, there's no parallel here. It is just a good, I think the ceremony they do on the day at the football, I think it's a fantastic ceremony and it really involves people, especially some people who go from the dawn service when we could have them to the football. So we're going to talk about sport tonight. It's not all about, I guess, the war side of things. We're going to talk about sport because about a week ago in the UK, literally a week ago, it was released that a Super League of teams were going to be formed. Basically, for people who aren't sort of up with the soccer side of things, and soccer is probably my favourite sport. We might talk about soccer and sports in a couple of weeks' time and what our sports are, but essentially there was 12 teams from different countries, Italian teams, Spanish teams, and English teams, who were going to form a Super League of 12 who would play each other through the year. So essentially it'd be a closed league with no promotion and relegation. You're a UK correspondent. Is that broadly correct, sir?
Yes, that is broadly correct. It's certainly been an interesting week over here. I think, as somebody who has been incredibly fortunate to go to a Anzac Day Australian football match, it is, possibly second to the grand final in back home. And I think being over here this week, I know, you're the soccer advocate here. I'm certainly the AFL advocate on our podcast. But I think being over here this week, I didn't fully appreciate what sport meant to the English as much as I have just in the last few days with this entire saga, and really how sport is ultimately, or can be ultimately, an extension and connection to the whole of society, which is where I think, as you've said, there's absolutely no parallel in terms of, there's no way of even getting close to finding a way to honour those who gave their lives in Gallipoli. And to be honest, I was quite hopeful to actually be at a Gallipoli dawn service living over here this year. Obviously, COVID is still a major factor, but I certainly hope to do that before coming home. But sport is something that brings that passion and that energy and, that kind of, I guess, heat that connects people and connects us to a cause. And this week in the UK has been very interesting on that front.
I was going to say, maybe that's why you haven't actually, I guess, maybe I don't say penny hasn't dropped, like you haven't seen it because it hasn't existed over there, because there's been no crowds at the soccer or football basically since you've almost got there.
Pretty much, yeah.
So then to see the Super League concept be released, which is essentially I guess these 12 teams, which were going to be up to 15 teams, being entitled to be in this particular competition and exclude everyone else through no competition, it got the whole of sort of England and a fair bit of Europe talking. But also the teams who were actually involved in it, the teams who were going to benefit from it, the interesting part was their fans were really pushing back more violently than anyone else. I say violently as in opinion-wise. It was the teams who were involved were actually probably the most vocal.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what it did was it struck a nerve with people over here, and rightly so, that, sport is, in its truest sense, the ultimate leveler. At the end of the day, you run out there, whether you're rich, poor, white, black, anything, if you're on that sporting pitch, giving it your best, and the Olympics are a great example of that, but in particular sport, it's what happens on the court on the day. Doesn't matter anything that's happened beforehand, not going to matter anything that happens after. I think that's why we love it, is that anything can happen, and it is a true leveler of people that are athletic and are participating there. What happened over here in frank terms was a bunch of elitist 1%ers creating a league that you were allowed to be in essentially due to your club's wealth, not necessarily because they were, they'd earned a spot, or they'd won something, or they'd done that. And the players, let alone the fans, literally had no idea, and it had gone so deep into materializing. JP Morgan had back financed the thing by $3.5 billion. Like, we're talking huge money here. And it spilled out. I think on Friday, there was an interview with one of the players, and they're basically like, of one of the teams that was going to be in there. So this person, you would dare say, would financially profit himself quite well. And they were like, "Did you know about this?" And he's like, I'm literally finding out about it as you guys are." And his opinion was that no, it's terrible because it ultimately takes what is something that is, come out of community grassrooted levels, and the fans and the clubs are ultimately, dare I say, should be owned by the fans. That they're the ones that, without them, there is no competition in none of these things. It takes it away from them, and that's where I think the backlash over here, up until the point of, Boris Johnson got involved, but he's neither here nor there. But the Prince actually got involved, and the Royals do not get involved in anything. And the Prince came out and just said, "This is wrong," and that was
Well, his team
really
wasn't.
surprising.
His team wasn't included because he's a West Ham supporter, I believe.
Yeah, well, maybe that's why.
But it's funny though. I don't say it's funny. Like in a little bit of background here, in the UK, a lot of the soccer clubs are privately owned or listed on a stock exchange. So some of the bigger clubs like Manchester United are on the stock exchange. Liverpool have US owners. Manchester City are owned by Middle Eastern owners. Tottenham, God only knows, who cares about Tottenham. But effectively,
Chelsea, I'm pretty sure, is owned by the Russians.
Yeah. I think you're right. Chelsea's owned by a Russian guy, so they're all very wealthy owners and all very privately sort of owned, a bit like I guess the American football, the gridiron, or whatever you want to call that over there. So a bit like the gridiron, they're all privately owned, and this was like the privately owned entities essentially creating their own league with no relegation and no sort of promotion. But you're a big advocate of AFL. There's no relegation and promotion in the AFL.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's a closed league. Like in the English Premier League, and in the Champions League, you have to qualify for it. In the English Premier League, the bottom three teams will be relegated. The AFL, there's no relegation. The NRL, there's no relegation. The A League over here, the Australian soccer, there's no relegation. They're essentially closed competitions to some extent.
Yeah, they are, but I think the AFL in particular is formed over the years through what was the VFL, to then migrating across to the nation and so forth. But I think the big difference that I see in the parallels between the two, in that soccer or football, shall we say, over here, being a relegated situation, there is also no salary caps over here. There's no draft elements. There's no ability for the ladder to generally change too much unless of privatization. Whereas if you take something like the AFL, that is effectively a closed competition. However, it's closed because nobody owns it. Nobody can go in there. You can't effectively start a business, which you can over here with a football club. You could pick a spot, start a club, pump $1 billion into it, pull some great players, and before you know it, you could be in the Premier League. Whereas the AFL, you go, well, actually, there's salary caps, there's draft picks. So, like my team this year, North Melbourne, doing absolutely terrible, still yet to win a game. I'm hoping that the draft is good this year, because it's not another 10 years of, because we're a poor club, we're going to be at the bottom. There's an element of, there is no private ownership of AFL. I mean, you could argue that Eddie Maguire maybe owns Collingwood, but he doesn't on paper. It is genuinely owned by the members and the fans. Very, very different over here, I find. And it's interesting what you say, because the European, what they proposed, these business people, that has caused so much backlash. What they propose is fundamentally not illegal. It's not allowed, because, as you said, it's an unrelegated market over here. But I think where they went really, really wrong was they didn't talk to the players, they didn't talk to the fans. They essentially took what is known over here as, dare I say, the world's game or the people's game, essentially took it away from the people. And I think that's where it's really come unstuck. And people, and one of the reasons that I think, going back to what we were saying about the Anzac game and why it is so, dare I say, beautiful in Australia, absolutely, because the way that they honour those who fought in Anzac, and the opening ceremonies and the playing of the salutes and so forth. But when you're there, you know it's a game for the people. Like, it is there truly for everybody, rich, poor, indifferent. That is the fundamental, I believe, as a sports purist, what sport is. And the second that you take that away, you've destroyed the psychological contract with the people that matter most, which is the fans.
And do you think the owners of these teams, and I guess the sport in general, over the last 12 months, with the lack of people actually at the games, do you think the connection was lost? So people misread the situation.
Yeah, I think so. And I
Because
think
there's no
it's going to
passion.
be
It wasn't, it wasn't 20 or 50,000 people on the terraces, every week singing and, showing that passion. Like, it's a very sterile environment still watching the European. I won't get up tonight at midnight and watch a soccer, but if it was on at 5 o'clock, I'd get up and watch it. I'll be watching on Friday when Manchester United play Roma. It's a very sterile environment, much like the football was last year. It's unusual. And I dare say it's more passionate, the support of soccer and football, than the AFL. So maybe not having people in the stands for 12 months and the financial burden of that as well, it just kind of warped the ownership's sort of view of these sort of things. I don't know. I don't know why I'm playing devil's advocate. You're the capitalist here.
This is the thing. It's quite interesting because we were actually talking about this morning. I was talking about here, and yeah, as you know, I'm quite pro-capitalist. This has crossed the line though, even for me as a pro-capitalist. Because, and I think you might be right. I think you might have touched on something that, at the end of the day, actually what they've done is they've constructed a paper deal that was backed in by advertising rights and revenues and marketing and, corporate propaganda, dare we say, that probably didn't feel too too out there for them, because the last 12 months there haven't been fans there haven't been, bars packed in the streets and that kind of thing. So potentially they have lost that connection there, and that could, you could maybe almost forgive them for that. But I think, I think it's a Super Rugby back home in Australia has now come under venture capital finance as actually a thing to save that sport. And more, I mean, sport in itself is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's massive as a business in itself. And I think we're going to find more and more parallels of where do we hit this sweet spot of actually this is the people's game, but at the end of the day, it is a, dare I say, probably even $1 trillion business, owned by people that are very commercial and have pumped a lot of money into this. Now, I think they've done it completely wrong with what they've done here. But I just wonder, and you're a football fan, is this an opportunity for the fans to kind of take it back a bit and go, hang on, maybe it's run away a little bit?
I guess the hard bit is, Manchester United's conservatively valued at $3 billion. Where does, if they go back to the German model, which is 51% of all clubs need to be owned by the fans, where do you find the $1.5 billion for to kind of buy out the guys who've stumped up money to buy it in the first place? Albeit they bought it for about $750 million, I think. That's now worth $3 billion over the last 15 years. But what happens to that $1.5 billion? Are you going to crowdfund 1 million people putting in $1,500 each or something?
It's a lot of people, isn't it? And then if you multiply that out over the landscape, I haven't actually ever asked who do you support?
In the English Premier League, I've always supported Manchester United since I was really
Man
young.
United.
My dad used to support them when George, kind of when George Best was playing, who at, at his peak was the best player in the world. So yeah, I've been a Man United supporter since I was a little one.
No, very nice.
Back when they were crap.
It's a fair. So you were before they were injected with a heap of cash and happy days.
Back when they were crap.
I mean, it's the tricky thing, isn't it? Like the market, the game in itself that has become a market unknowingly, probably to fans over the last 20 years, is now a market that is worth pretty much only enough that the 1% can play in. Because you're right, how do you get, fans to stump up $1.5 billion? It's a lot of money. So I don't know where we get to in this paradox, but I think what's really interesting is how powerful it became that the voice of the fans was. I mean, effectively, this story, I believe, broke, dare I say, Friday. I might be wrong on my facts there, Thursday, Friday. Maybe it's happened within a few days, basically, that within 48 hours, the whole thing went from a multi-billion-dollar European league to everyone's pulled out and people are losing their shit.
And their jobs. A couple of CEO of one of the clubs, Manchester United, actually, he resigned. Apparently not on the back of this, but I'm almost certain because he was ex JP Morgan that he might have been quite involved in the wheeling and dealing. So yeah, people are losing their minds and their jobs as well. So it's just been a complete balls up and kind of unthought through. But maybe if this happened 12 months down the track when fans were back in the stands and they'd been in the stands for 12 months and they put an idea like this forward, people might have been a bit more receptive to it. But maybe for it to happen when a fan hasn't set foot in a soccer stadium to watch their team for 12 months and it feels like it's just a sterile corporate sort of thing to be doing, there's no goodwill there because everyone's just watching it on TV.
Yeah, and I think as much as it has turned into a multi billion-dollar business or whatnot, I think all sport is at risk with this situation, and I really hope it doesn't happen of missing or forgetting their origins. Like effectively, apart from some very, dare I say, posh sports like polo and all that kind of thing, like soccer was played by, the armies in World War One, World War Two, while they were, waiting between attacks and those sort of things. AFL was played by the Anzacs. A lot of these clubs, Man United's a prime example, potentially the most famous club in the world, was true working class roots background. I mean, now you go and play with them and you're set for life. You made more money in a year than most people make in a lifetime. But all the AFL clubs came out of that real kind of, you would work, then you would play, and that's where the fan bases are from. And it's now, how do we find this medium so that doesn't get lost amongst all the money that is flying around?
Yeah, I think you're right because this would be the equivalent of, say, if we're going to break it back down to AFL terms, it'd be equivalent of Collingwood, Essendon, Richmond, Carlton, West Coast, and maybe Adelaide just going, well, see you later. Wouldn't want to be here.
Yeah, basically. We're up there. We got the money, and we're going to join a New Zealand team and a Indonesian team. Let's assume that they all played in our little pocket down the bottom there, and suddenly there's now an elitist competition.
Yeah, but sport is business now. Business and sport and business are that closely aligned. The lines are sort of blurred because sport is now a big business, especially when there's television rights involved. Like the AFL is $1 billion television right. The NRL is not far off that, and we're small fry. Like the EPL is probably the biggest rights for TV market in the whole world. Like it literally, that is a cash cow. So I understand bigger teams who contribute more, maybe wanting more out of it, but that doesn't sit well with the vast majority of people.
especially with if they are under private ownership. And I can, as a pro capitalist, I can completely agree with that. And it's the thing of, I suppose, how do we acknowledge that horse is bolted 100%, like what you say, sport is a business now. There's no getting around that. But how do you have a successful business, like anyone's successful business, still be true to the core product that it is? And that, at the end of the day, is just a damn good game to watch. That brings people together.
Yeah, you're not wrong there, mate. Sport is just a wonderful thing and a wonderful relief from the everyday grind. I understand why people are very tribal about it. I think it's a good place to wrap up for this week on Daddy Eats Last. Remember to subscribe to Daddy Eats Last on iTunes if you haven't done already. And while you're there, please leave a review. Also, tell your mates about the podcast, especially if they are guys. Most of all, thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week with another episode, or should I say serving, of Daddy Eats Last. How's that for a dad joke? Catch you next week.